The date is Friday, May 20th, 2016. The time is 12 noon. The location is the Yankee Air Museum at Willow Run Airport in Ypsilanti, Michigan. The time is 11:53. The person being interviewed is Mr. William Hopping. Mr. Hopping was born on September 23, 1932, and he served principally as a forward observer in the 42nd Field Artillery Battalion of the 4th Infantry Division in the United States Army. The interview will be conducted by Michael Navalta, a volunteer interviewer with the Yankee Air Museum and a U.S. Air Force veteran. This interview is being brought to you by the generosity of the Yankee Air Museum and is being conducted on behalf of the Oral History Department of Yankee Air Museum in Belleville, Michigan. Also present at this interview is Mr. Jerry Jessen, our videographer, also with Yankee Air Museum, and Ms. Lori Hopping, Bill's daughter. The purpose of this interview is to record Mr. Hopping's life experiences of post-World War II and the beginnings of the Cold War for the United States Library of Congress and the Yankee Air Museum Oral History Collection. Let's begin our interview. Good morning, Mr. Hopping. May I call you Bill?
Please do.
Thank you, and please call me Mike. Let's start again by asking you to tell us your birthday.
I was born in Detroit on September 23rd, 1932.
Okay. And born at home. You were also born at home at that time.
Yes, with a midwife.
Okay.
This was the middle of the Depression, and that was not unusual.
Okay. Can you tell me about your parents?
Well, my father, Louis Hopping, was born in 1900, so we always knew how old he was. He was born in Havana, Illinois. He went to the University of Illinois, and then finally to George Washington University in the East, where he earned his law degree and also his certificate to practice. Louis was in the Navy in World War II. He joined the Navy one day after graduating from high school. And he served on a destroyer in the Atlantic, not for a long period of time. And then when he was discharged, he was looking for work. He found a position with a Michigan congressman by the name of Clarence McLeod. And he did that job for a while. And then he was offered a job as an assistant district attorney in the Detroit area. So in 1930, he moved the family to Detroit and bought a house there. And he did that job during the war, during World War II. Some of the work that he contributed to was the prosecution of the Purple Gang, a notorious gang in Detroit. And also, one of the German POWs escaped from a camp there in Detroit. I think it was over by the fairgrounds. There was a POW camp there. And he was missing for a number of days. They found out later that he was aided in his escape by some German-American citizens. They were part of an organization called the German-American Bund, B-U-N-D, and it was kind of a fifth column organization. Subsequently, he was reapprehended, and those people were prosecuted. My father had a hand in that as also. Later,
he also had a part in trying to stop the internment of Japanese citizens.
Yes, that was a big item.
Tell us a little bit about that.
The government wanted to move all citizens, American citizens of Japanese descent, to these internment camps in the desert. My father, along with several other people, fought that very hard and finally convinced the government that those citizens in the Midwest did not have to go to the internment camps. And he was very proud of that.
He also served as a blackout or air raid warden too?
Yes, he was an air raid warden on our block, and we had blackouts, and his job was to ensure the commitment to the blackout. And it was difficult because people said, you know, we're not going to get bombed here, and didn't always comply. Later in the war, they did, but initially it was a hard job.
Moving on, he became an assistant district attorney. You said he didn't make much money as a prosecutor.
Government salaries in those days were very small, and he was supporting 4 children and grandma. And so after the war in 1947, he went into private practice. And it was a little easier then, but during the Depression and during the war, things were very difficult economically for us. We had a lot of hand-me-down clothes. My mother sewed many of our clothes. Money was tight. And even after he went into private practice, we still were taught to conserve on everything.
Very good. After he retired from private practice, he then went to Plymouth, Michigan, and tell us a little bit about what happened there.
My dad always wanted to be a judge. Well, he wasn't a judge, but he was appointed a magistrate in Plymouth after he had retired from private practice. And as a magistrate, he sat in for the judges, handling the various affairs. And then he became an expert at weddings, and he conducted maybe 500 weddings over the years.
And that's a good lead into your mother, Helen.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about her.
My mother made a wedding cake for most of those weddings, and that was a big job, and it wasn't really to make money. It was just, she was a great cook, and she did catering work as well. So it was to make the wedding complete.
Mm-hmm. So she was born where?
Sorry.
She was born where?
Yes, Mom. My mother was born in Waukegan, Illinois. And when she was a child, she played with a young boy by the name of Benny Kubalski, later known as Jack Benny.
There you go.
So she told that story a number of times.
She also, as a housewife, she did a lot of volunteer work too?
She did a lot of volunteer work besides feeding a family of 7. She was volunteer mostly at the high school and did a lot of work for the high school.
It was Mackenzie High School, right?
Yeah, Mackenzie High School. And then during the war, early in the war, we were advised of the project of Victory Gardens. She was the major force in our Victory Garden. We found some vacant land down on Oakland Boulevard in Detroit. It was not very good soil, but we had that plowed up, and she planted a lot of vegetables.
Now that was a community garden?
A lot of civilians went down and did the same thing as part of the war effort.
Right.
My mother was a big believer in green beans, and she planted some of the longest bean rows I've ever seen in my life, and that was my job to take care of those. So
there you go. She was also did something with the Detroit Review Club.
She was an officer of the Detroit Review Club. That was a women's club that did charitable work in Detroit at the time.
Okay. Your grandmother was also very influential in your life too. She lived with you?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about your grandmother.
Grace Boutwell was my grandmother, and her husband died at a very early age, and she was left a widow, so she came to live with my parents, and she was part of our family for as long as I can remember. A grand old lady, she and I took many trips during the war. I'd say our favorite trip was to go to Boblo on the Boblo boat. And we also went to some movies. Our favorite there was newsreels, because we could get up to date on the war situation. And there was a newsreel theater in Detroit on Woodward Avenue, and that's all they showed was newsreels. We were coming out of that theater one day, and there was a huge headline on a paper right out the door, and it said FDR dead. So that was kind of a shocking event as well. He didn't live to see the end of the war.
Right. She also took you to the Verner's plant too, the ginger ale plant.
Yes. Well, when we got off
samples there.
When we got off the Boblo boat, the ginger ale plant was right there by the river, and I don't know why, but the ginger ale always tasted better in the factory there.
There you go.
Than from a bottle.
Your siblings, Jean, Irene, and brother George. Just anything you can tell us a little bit about them?
Yes, just quickly. Jean was the oldest daughter. She was born in 1925. My parents were still living in the East at that time. And Jean was a housewife. She was an excellent athlete and a good tennis player. Irene was next. She was born in 1927. Irene was an accomplished artist. She did illustrations for newspapers and for the Filene department store in Boston. And then finally, my brother George was born in 1929 in October, and this was 1 month before the Great Depression. And then I was born in 1932.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about your wife, Marilyn.
My wife, Marilyn, is a very accomplished artist. She went to Cass Tech High School in Detroit, and then she graduated from the Art Institute of Chicago, and she became a teacher. She taught art and English, and she was a wonderful mother to our children.
She was your childhood friend, and then it evolved into marriage in 1958?
Yes, we were neighborhood friends, and we finally married in 1958. And our children grew up there in Northville, Michigan.
Okay. You've got 3 children, Louise, Lorraine, and William. Tell us a little bit about those.
Louise was the first. She was born in 1959, and she has been a teacher for many years. She's currently at St. Michael's School in Livonia. Lori, the next daughter, was born in 1961.
Don't say anything bad about her. She's sitting right
here
here
today.
1960.
She's a writer. She has published many books and articles, and she's also a game inventor too. So then our third was William, our son, or Bill. He's an attorney in Philadelphia. He's married to Yolanda, and they have 3 children. So our grandchildren are 2 fraternal twins, Sophia and Irene. And then the son was Daniel, or Danny, and he's a sophomore in high school right now.
Okay. To review, you were born with the help of a midwife in your family home on Indiana Street in Detroit. And you said that was not unusual during the Depression. You later moved. Tell us a little bit about that move and how far it was.
Yes, we didn't move far, but we had 4 children and Grandma. We needed more room. We moved on the same street up to a big, large frame house, 5 bedrooms, near Noble School, the grade school there, and near the playfield, which was good for me. I was on the playfield all the time, unless I had chores to do. And so we settled into this house close to the grade school.
Okay. You attended West Lawn Methodist Church? Now, was that in the area too?
I did. Principally, the reason was to play on the basketball team.
There you go. So you were a jock back then. You played basketball, and what else?
A lot of baseball.
And
basketball, and we played some sandlot hockey on the pound. It wasn't organized in those years.
At one point, you were a Class E championship.
We had a baseball team, 15 years old, and just a neighborhood team. We kept playing and winning, and finally we won a city championship.
You also played baseball at Mackenzie High School and Michigan State University,
Played
correct?
baseball in both places.
Okay. So money was tight during the Depression. Tell us just a little bit about growing up in the Depression.
Well, my mother sewed, and we wore a lot of hand-me-downs. I got in trouble one day wearing my sister's shirt to school. Took a lot of kidding over that, but it was necessary. We had to do that.
You talked about the newsreels. You told me that when you were young and during the war, you used the newsreels and newspapers and magazines to follow all the battles and all the different structures that were going on during World War II, making little maps and drawing arrows and things like that. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the principal magazine that had maps was Time magazine, and they would always have maps with arrows showing the tactical movements of the armies, and I was glued to that. Especially when we made progress in the war. And then there were Life magazine and Look magazine. Both had many photographs. And that was interesting to me too. And that's where I first saw a photograph of a B-17. And I thought that was a really good looking plane. And I began reading about it in the stories, and I read that despite being heavily damaged, they were able to fly back to their bases in England, and I admired that too. And I admired the crews that went up and withstood the flak and the German fighters. And we were not especially aware of the losses in the ground troops. I don't think they printed that very much, but we were aware of the number of planes that were lost. And that was dramatic, and I had a great admiration for those people that went up in those planes.
You would think that back then the ground troops would have had the highest casualties, but we both know that the air crews over Germany had the highest death rate in World War II as far as the troops go.
Yes.
Since you told me about this, I went out and found this, and I'd like to present this to you. It's a book that I found that I think you might be interested in. It's got lots of arrows and battles and stuff like that. Oh, that's true. And you can take a look at that after, but I got that for you because I thought of your interest.
It reminds me that I have a book for you.
Uh-oh, I'm in trouble now. Okay, speaking of the B-17, what are you doing next weekend? Here at Yankee.
Yes, on Wednesday next week, I'm taking a flight on a B-17.
You looking forward to that?
My daughters, Louise and Lori, arranged that for me, and I'm just thrilled about it.
Good for you. Good for you.
It'll be great. So I'm really looking forward to that, Mike.
Okay. You also went to see the Tigers at Briggs Stadium and the Red Wings at Olympia. You told me you liked watching Doc Kramer catch baseballs in his back pocket.
Right.
Explain that to me.
I used to take a bus down when I was 11 or 12. In those days, it wasn't a serious problem. And I sat in the bleachers by myself, usually had a scorecard, keeping score, and enjoyed the ball games. Doc Kramer was a center fielder for Detroit, and before the game, he would entertain the people in the bleachers by catching fly balls in his rear pocket. It's not easy.
No.
Later on, I tried, and it's not easy at all, but he could do it every time. Very entertaining.
You also went to Olympia a lot, too, and tell us about meeting some players over there.
The hockey was big in Detroit, and still is. It's a very big sport. We had Gordie Howe, Ted Lindsay, Alex Del Vecchio, and great teams in the 50s, and so I've seen many a hockey game.
Did you get to meet them?
No, my son met Gordie Howe.
Okay.
One time, and Gordie was a terrific gentleman, and he's still alive, still meeting people.
Okay. Let's move forward and back at the same time for a little bit. Can you tell me, it's a question I ask everybody of a certain age, can you tell me where you were and how you felt when you heard that Pearl Harbor had been bombed?
That was a very dramatic day for us because my sister Irene, that was her birthday, December 7th. And we had spent the whole day with the whole family celebrating her birthday. And then the news came on in the afternoon on the radio. And we gathered around the radio to hear what was happening. My father got out maps, and we looked to see where Pearl Harbor was, and it was just a shocking event. We were all shocked and concerned about what the future held. I remember that, and quite a hard memory there for that day.
You told me that your dad had the ability to make a recording and had a radio and phonograph and had family members say a short piece about
Yes, we
Pearl
did.
Harbor at the time. Is that still available, or is that?
I'll have to hunt for it.
Okay.
It may not be. My dad bought a Wilcox Gay radio phonograph recordio, very new in those days. And so he did get the recording out, and we all said a few words. Right now, I can't find that tape.
Okay.
I'm still looking for it.
So what were your feelings about that, right at that particular moment?
About Pearl Harbor?
About Pearl Harbor.
Well, we were all shocked, but I was still young. I was 10, 11, and but I wondered, how long it was going to take. Mm-hmm. That was the principal question.
Yep. So, you also, during the war, you told me that there was an incident where a neighbor, one of their sons had died, a Navy flyer. Can you tell me a little bit about that incident in the neighborhood?
Yes, I can. I was probably 11 then. It was early 1942, and word had gotten around the neighborhood that one of our neighbors, a Navy pilot, was killed in the Pacific, and the people in the neighborhood just began to drift over to the house, and pretty soon there was 40 or 50 people just standing around in front of the house, giving support and sympathy to the mother of this boy. I knew him, but we weren't friends, but everybody knew who he was. And finally, the mother came out and said a few words. I was across the street and I couldn't hear exactly what she said, but it was a very dramatic time. She went back in the house and the people disappeared. But it was our first experience with the death from the war, and
That made it all the more real.
yes, it certainly did. Brought the war home.
You graduated you went to grade school and junior high school at Noble and Tappan, and you graduated in 1950 from Mackenzie High School. You told me you were a B student.
Yes, throughout school, B student. I loved the literary courses, the reading and English. Not so good in the math.
College. You went to Michigan State University on a baseball scholarship and also ROTC. Tell us a little bit about those two
Well,
things.
that's true. I enrolled in Michigan State in 1950 on a baseball scholarship. The first year that I was there, the government mandated that all students take a test. It was a long, hard test, very similar to the SAT today, I think. And you had to score at least 80 in order to continue your schooling. If you didn't reach that level, you were subject to the draft. Korea was hot at that time. Well, I did pass that test, and I was able to continue at Michigan State and graduated there in 1954. Part of the classes that I had were ROTC classes. We studied military tactics. We didn't do any field work. We did a little drilling. But I always felt that the ROTC didn't really prepare us for Army duty later.
Right.
But in junior and senior years, we took summer camps down in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the artillery school. And that's where we really learned what the Army was all about.
And you liked the idea of going to artillery, right?
Well, we learned a lot. We learned a lot about artillery and the guns and so forth.
Okay.
And I knew I was going into the artillery. I had a choice between that and the infantry and anti-aircraft. And I had chosen the artillery, so I knew that's where I was going to end up.
There was also something kind of minor, I guess, but you also played for Michigan State when they finished runner-up in the World Series College Baseball Classic in Omaha.
Yes, we had a good high school team, and we had a good team at Michigan State. And in my senior year, we won regional championships and went to Omaha, where they hold the College World Series. And they still do today. But they do it in a newer stadium now.
Right.
That was one of the first years they had that program.
Okay, so you graduated in 1954, and your degree was in?
Yes, I had a degree in journalism. I looked around for some newspapers, but I knew I was going into the Army for
Right.
at least 2 years, and that wasn't a big priority at that time.
Told me that you were obligated to serve 2 years active duty and another 6 years in inactive reserves, subject to a call-up.
That's true.
So for
right.
the next 8 years, your life was fairly much planned at that point as far as anything that might have happened or did happen.
Yes.
Okay? So where did you start in the Army? Back at Fort Sill?
After graduation, I was assigned to Fort Sill, or the Officers Candidate School. That was a 12-week course, and that was very tough. Long hours and difficult subjects, a lot of math that I was not really proficient in. But we got through it. I had several friends from Michigan, and all of my friends successfully completed that.
There was a high failure rate too, right?
But a good many people didn't.
Right. What happened to them? Do you know? To the ones that didn't make it, what happened to them?
Well, they were subject to the draft.
Okay.
And,
So then they would go on as enlisted
probably
in the
ended up
draft.
in Korea because that was the war at the time.
So at this time, you confirmed your choice of artillery as the branch of service you wanted to be in.
Well, I picked the artillery, and I only had about a week's leave before I went to Germany to join the artillery unit. They were in a hurry to get us over there.
Yep.
And so I was put on a military air transport cargo plane. And it did carry seats at times, but the seats were removed. And we sat on cushions for the entire flight over. But I have to tell you, when you're young, it wasn't that bad.
Not so bad.
And we flew into Rhine-Main Air Force Base in Frankfurt.
There you go. So you were commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army in August of '54. Most of your class, you told me, went to Korea, but you and several of your close friends ended up going to West Germany because you said there was a shortage of people there. You had that 1 week of leave. You took that long flight to Rhine-Main in Germany, near Frankfurt, and you were there. Once you got there, you were assigned to the 4th Infantry Division and the 42nd Artillery Battalion under Colonel McCready. Is that correct?
That's true. I reported to Colonel McCready. He was the battalion commander.
He gave you a briefing. Tell us about that.
He immediately told me what the mission was for the unit. And he spent some time making that very clear. We were part of the 4th Infantry Division, and we were stationed in an area of Germany called the Fulda Gap. The Fulda Gap was a flat area where many former armies had gone through because of the terrain there. And we were opposed by hundreds divisions of the Russian army and the Russian East Bloc armies as well, a huge amount of divisions. And our job was to block them in the event that they invaded the West. It was going to be a very difficult assignment. We had nearly the men that the other side had. So that was constantly on our mind all the time that we were in Germany.
It was 40 miles from the east.
We were
from the
very
Warsaw Pact.
very close to East Germany, and Russia at the time, this was the Cold War, was very belligerent. They had arrested one or two American servicemen and refused to release them. And
So, to summarize, from what I've read of history, you were the first line of defense for the West and NATO at that time, and the outcomes were pretty much settled that you were going to lose, and all you were trying to do was delay the invasion. Is that about right? Does that sound about right?
that's true. We were assigned a particular position, and we were called out on alerts almost monthly. And during an alert, we had to take everything, all the guns and the trucks and everything, out to our defensive position. And of course, the object was to see how fast we could do it and how efficient we could be. And we were pretty good at that. I never heard any complaints about us taking too long to do that. Alerts could come any time of the day or night. So we were constantly reminded that what our mission was there.
Just as a note, the 4th Infantry Division was sent to West Germany in 1950 and stayed there for 6 years to defend against the communist threat to Western Europe, Western Germany. The Ivy men of the 4th Division were based originally in Fort Lewis, Washington, before being shipped to Vietnam for the remainder of that war. The name Ivy men comes from the Roman numeral IV-4 for the 4th Infantry Division. 42nd Field Artillery Battalion supported the 12th Infantry Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division. How many guns did you have?
We had 3 batteries. Each battery had 6 105 millimeter howitzers. They were towed by a 2.5-ton truck. And so we had 18 guns altogether in the battalion. I was very good at being a forward observer in the tests and in practice, and so that's what I became. I would go up on the hill in front of the battery with a radio man, radio back coordinates. The battery would fire 1 shell, and then I would adjust the fire until we were accurate on the target. And then I would call down for fire for effect, and the entire battery would fire on the target.
There you go.
I was good at that.
Even though math was required, I'm sure.
It wasn't something that everybody wanted to do because life expectancy was not great in that
You were
job.
in front of the guns. You were up close to the enemy at that point.
Right, exactly.
You told me a little bit about a really large rocket called the Honest John. Tell me a little bit more about the Honest John.
I'm sorry.
The Honest John.
Oh, yes. We had these small howitzers, but the Army was developing new artillery at the time, and they developed a rocket called the Honest John. It was a huge rocket. They didn't keep it very long because it had no guidance systems. They fired it at a target, and they had no control over it after that. We found out about the Honest John because I was in the field at the time with my radio man. We were getting ready to do some training work there, and the Honest John went over our heads. Horrendous noise. We didn't know what it was at the time. Found out later that it was the Honest John. But that wasn't successful. They didn't keep that very long. They were developing tactical atomic tactics at the time. And in order to do that, they developed a howitzer that was huge, 280 millimeters. a huge gun that fired huge shells, atomic shells, if they wanted to. And we were invited to a demonstration of this gun. We were sitting directly behind the gun, and they fired a shell into the hills about 20 miles away. The shell was so large that we could see the whole shell, the whole distance, the whole 20 miles. But that gun was large and hard to move around, and that gun was not kept very long either.
Right. The object back then was you were so outnumbered as far as the invading force versus the defending force that the atomic weapons were going to be used by the United States to even up the shall we say, the battle a little bit better. And that's what was, they started with that stuff there. The division mission in an invasion was to hold on as long as you could, delaying the enemy. Tell us what we were delaying there.
Well, our unit was pretty good in our practice and everything, but it was always on our mind that there were hundreds of divisions that we were facing. We would have done our job, but we had great hesitancy about whether we could stop East Bloc armies.
Forward observer was your title, and you were in front. You said you were very good at it, and you would give coordinates, like you said, and then fire for effect after that. War games were a very big part of readiness training, and you were involved with many of these and many alerts. You told us about field and war games and stuff like that, the aggressor and defender forces. Tell us a little bit about the war games.
We did participate in some war games. Some units were designated aggressor units. They usually wore white on their helmets. And we were principally a defender unit. And the games were dictated by the generals. And we played those. On one of the final war games that I participated in, I was an umpire. And my job was to take the instructions around to the units and make sure they complied with the games. As far as training, we were called down to a firing area down in southern Germany called Grafenwehr. Grafenwehr was used by the Germans as a firing spot, and it was maybe only 12 or 15 miles from the Czech border. So we were very close to East Bloc troops down there. We would go down there for usually 3 weeks and fire our guns and do a lot of training. And of course, I was doing a lot of forward observing at that time.
You said there were casualties in the live fire training.
I also served as a safety officer on occasion, making sure that the tubes were oriented in the right direction. But occasionally, a round would drop short. And it didn't happen in our unit, but we heard that some crews had been killed by our own shells landing short. These were usually radio crews that were running wire up to the forward observer. I used a radio until they ran a wire up to my position, and then we were able to phone back.
So historically, even though these were games, even though this was training, there was danger involved because any shell could take out the wrong people at the wrong time. Correct? Okay. You served safety officer. You said you told me a story about the battalion had a ceremony always on July 4th. And tell me about the German people reaction to that.
Well, this was 10 years after the war, so there were still a lot of feelings among the German population. Our battalion would have 4th of July exercises. We had a parade one year, nobody came. One year we invited civilians to come and look at the guns. Some children came and inspected the guns, but we had very few people. I could understand that. The war was only 10 years old. On the other hand, we had good relations with German civilians. We had friends in town that we could talk to. They were very unhappy about talking about the war, but on occasion, something would trigger something, and they would start telling us about the war. We were in a little town of Gelnhausen, and Gelnhausen was not a target, but it was a high ground, and the German civilians could stand up on the high ground and see the bombing in the distance, and on Hanau and Frankfurt, which were military installations. So we got along well, but there were some very hard feelings, and we ate out in the German economy whenever we could. We could get a very good meal for $4. One day we were in a small German town, and there was a Gasthaus there, that's what they called it. It was a restaurant and a bar. And they had some entertainment there in the form of a zither player. And when we walked in, he was playing one of the German tunes. Shortly after we sat down, we were in civilian clothes. Shortly after we sat down, he started making comments in German. And the other occupants of the restaurant were laughing and not really pointing at us, but it was clear that he was making derogatory comments. We heard the word pig at one time. And we were determined not to cause any incident there, so we just got up and left. But that was probably the most serious thing. When I made trips down to Frankfurt, occasionally I did see a number of young men dressed in black, riding around on motorcycles, and they were neo-Nazis. At the time I was there, I'm not aware they caused any trouble. They were just riding around and make themselves known.
Okay. Going back into filling in some gaps here, you used military script in place of United States currency. That was for reasons of the economy, not flooding the economy with dollars?
Well, we used military script. We could change that into marks when we went out to eat, as an example. We used military script, and that was one of my jobs also, was payday, and paydays were difficult. We issued the money in script, and the soldiers had been gambling. They gambled all the time, and there were winners and there were losers. And the winners were happy to get the money, but they hung around to get the money owed them from the losers. So paydays were difficult. One job I didn't really care for.
Going back, another story you told me about, you spoke a little German, and you went to a German Oktoberfest, and you said there was a situation there where you were dealing with some German war vets, including SS troops and U-boat troops.
That's true. You know, the Germans had many beer halls, big beer halls, and everybody would go and sit at the same table and drink beer, and they would sing. And we did that occasionally, and especially in Oktoberfest, which was like a Mardi Gras, and there was a happy occasion. They wore masks, and one day you couldn't really determine who you were going to sit with. I mean, people came and sat everywhere. And one day I was sitting there and enjoying myself, and a friend was with me, and these two German men started to make conversation with us and started asking us a lot of questions. And finally we said, well, what did you do during the war? And one of them said, I was an SS officer. And the other one said, I was in the U-boats. Well, the U-boats didn't bother me particularly, but the SS officer did. So again, we were determined we've been told not to cause any incidents. And so we just got up and left. I must say, there weren't many Germans of military age left.
Right.
A lot of women.
A lot of French and a lot of German citizens. They lost a whole generation pretty
Right.
much there. You said something about somebody shooting at an ammo dump one night.
I'm sorry.
Somebody shooting at an ammo dump one night?
We did. The only serious incident we had during the time we were stationed in Gelnhausen, but the ammo dump was up on a hill off by itself, of course, and somebody was taking some rifle shots, probably at the guards, not at the ammo itself. Anyway, we investigated, never found anybody, and they didn't hit anything, and there was no damage.
You had a buddy that talked you into going to Berlin, and that was a very scary situation for you. Tell us about that. A friend talked you into going to Berlin?
Oh, yes.
Tell us about that story, about the road and about the East Berlin and West Berlin.
One of our friends had been transferred to Berlin. He was a very smart fellow. He was fluent in German. And he said, why don't you guys come to Berlin? I'll show you around the town. It was a great opportunity. So we got in a car and we drove through over to the East German border where they had a checkpoint, a little house, a little shed. A Russian officer came out along with 3 or 4 East German soldiers. And they took our identity, which we knew they had a right to do, our identification cards. And they went back in their hut, and we sat around the house for quite a while. I think it was probably a half hour, and nothing was happening. And we were anxious to get going, and there were other people there waiting, one of whom was a British major who had his baton stick with him, and he had been there longer than we had, and he had enough. And he went over to the door, and he banged on that door as loud as he could, and he said, come on out of there, I want to get going, stop this nonsense. And they came out in a couple of minutes. The Russian came out, handed our identities back to us, and we were on our way, and we drove into Berlin.
And when you got to Berlin, there was another scary incident.
Yes.
Tell us about that one.
Which one was that?
You said something about going and wandering. The Berlin Wall had not gone up yet, and there were places that you weren't supposed to go, and you said there was one place where you were kind of scared.
Berlin was a very hard city to negotiate. The roads, the streets changed names right in the middle of the block, depending on what was there. If a church was there, the name would change. So we were looking around at various tourist sites, actually. There's still a lot of damaged buildings. The debris was gone, but the wall hadn't been built yet. That was built later. And the only earmark between the divisions, Berlin was divided into 4 sections. American, English, French, and East, and Russian. And there would be a big white sign when you were leaving one district and going into another. We were looking for buildings, and I saw this sign, but it didn't register immediately, and we went on a little further. Then it dawned on me that sign was saying, you're leaving the American zone, and we were going into the Russian zone. We made a fast U-turn. I saw in the mirror that the East German soldiers were coming out of their checkpoint. We weren't bothered, but we knew that 6 months before that, they had arrested a GI and kept him for 6 months before they released him. So there was a lot of tension.
Yes.
The Cold War was
And
hot.
that's what the Cold War was.
Yes.
The Cold War was a very tension-filled.
There were things happening all over the world as a result of the Cold War.
Korea, Vietnam, all those things are part of the Cold War.
Yes.
In most of your second year in West Germany, you taught classes on politics and how to be a forward observer. And you said the Army wanted troops to be able to carry out other duties. Tell us a little bit about that.
We did training in our base there, and one of my jobs was to teach politics. Some of the troops wondered why that was necessary, but the Army felt that we should know as much as we can about the enemy. So we discussed communism and Russia and a little bit about their military makeup. And we also did actually firing, practicing forward observing. We had a little cannon that shot little balls into a sand pit, and so we could reproduce firing and forward observing. And the idea was to have all the troops be able to do these if it became necessary. So we spent most of our time while in the camp there doing that kind of work.
Now your history comes back to, shall we say, reinsert itself, and people find out that you are a good baseball player. Tell us what happened next as far as baseball goes.
Well, we knew that we were going to be, the whole infantry division was going to be rotated back in July of '56. So I had a job counting the equipment. We were just continuing to do our job and waiting for that to happen. All of a sudden, I got a phone call from the Division Artillery General, and he said, Bill, I've been looking through the files and noticed that you were a baseball player. He said, I played a little bit in the minor leagues, he told me, and he said, I want you to take over our baseball team, and I want you to beat the damn infantry. So I had no choice. He had already cut the orders. It was not a popular decision in our battery because they were going to be down an officer, and I was not too happy about that. But I reported down to the next town where the baseball team was located, and we requisitioned a bus, and we kept that team busy playing games pretty much all over West Germany. We tried to play the Air Force because we knew they ate better and the facilities were better.
That's still the same today.
We played a few Air Force teams, and we played quite a bit around Germany. We were very good. At one time, we won 13 straight. I had some good ball players. I ought to mention that we were down one time near Munich, and we came across a sign for the Dachau concentration camp. This team was a bunch of young players. They were energetic, talked a lot, joked a lot. But when we got off the bus in Dachau, there was absolute silence. We stood in front of those ovens, and nobody said a thing. And that was quite a moment for us to observe what had taken place there. Later on, we came back to our base, and we were to play the infantry in a doubleheader on the last day, and both generals were there. They were sitting right behind the backstop, and he had bet $50 on it. It doesn't seem like much now, but
Oh, it was a lot back
in the
then.
50s, it was big money, I guess. So we played the doubleheader, and we were good. We beat the infantry twice. And the general came out, and he says, that's great. He said, I'm going to try to fly you all home so you don't have to take a Liberty ship. But that never happened.
That didn't work out very well. So now you're a first lieutenant. You've been promoted to first lieutenant. And they asked you at this point in time to stay beyond your tour. And what did you tell them?
No, I had several conversations with Colonel McCready, and he tried his hardest to get me to stay in the Army. But I chose the civilian life. I really wanted to be a civilian. So that's finally he gave up. And
there you go. So now you're put on a train, and you've got on that train are not only troops returning home, but you've also got MPs and prisoners on the train. Tell us a little bit about your role there.
Well, the Army had their bad actors, and they had some soldiers that were convicted of really tough crimes, murder and other extensive crimes. So they wanted to send, I think about 50 of them. They were handcuffed. They were put on a train and sent to Bremerhaven to be put on a boat to come back and do their time back in the States. So I was received another order to be in charge of this train, but the real duty was done by the MPs. They kept track of the prisoners, and we didn't have any trouble. We got up to Bremerhaven, which was a prime fort there in Germany. It had been bombed extensively because submarine bases were there. And that's where we finally caught the boat to come home to the States.
This boat was an old Liberty ship, well, probably not at that time old, but a Liberty ship called the USS General Rose, and they were not the, shall we say, the easiest riding ships in the Navy at that point.
No, it wasn't, but we had been told that the General Rose was one of the better Liberty ships. They were still using them to transport troops. You know, during the war, they had used the big liners, the United States and other liners. And those were not available, so we were using the Liberty ships. We were told the General Rose was the best, and so we loaded up there. And one day, out of Bremerhaven, we ran into a terrific storm.
2-day storm, right?
It lasted 2 days. Almost the entire ship was sick. Very surprisingly to me, I did not get sick at that occasion. The General Rose had a permanent list of about 5 degrees. And so we got used to walking, leaning over a little bit. When we finally got off the boat in New York, we had trouble walking.
You were listing 5 degrees yourself.
But we did go by the Statue of Liberty and the New York Harbor.
How long was the voyage?
You know, it was 9 tough days.
9 tough days.
The weather was bad. We got into the New York Harbor, and I was due to be discharged in Fort Dix over in New Jersey. And so we had to take a little motor launch from New York over to New Jersey. And I was very sick.
So you didn't get sick on the Liberty ship, but you got sick on the launch.
Yes, I did.
Very good. After discharge now, you're out of the Army. You married your wife in 1958. And your post-military career, tell us a little bit about State Farm Insurance and places like that.
I didn't find a job in the journalism business. I did talk to a couple of newspapers and nothing developed. Meanwhile, I looked into handling insurance claims. During the Army, one of my jobs had been to settle claims by the German civilians over damage that had been caused by tanks and our field exercises. And I kind of liked that. I was pretty good at that, too. One time we had a tank that tore the facade off a narrow street in a village. That was the worst incident. Mostly they were fertilizer wagons and things like that. So I was presented this opportunity to continue to do that, insurance claims with State Farm. Stayed with them for a number of years and eventually transferred over to the Atlantic companies. and continued my career in claims.
And you were a regional officer at that point.
I ended up a regional officer with the Atlantic, and unfortunately, the Atlantic companies disappeared. They had insured a lot of property in New York, close to where the 9/11 building was, and they had horrendous losses. They went out of business, and I went over to an organization called the Michigan Catastrophic Claim Association, MCCA. They were organized to reimburse companies for the very expensive claims. So I did that for the last 7 years, and I took an early retirement at age 62 because Marilyn was a teacher for many years, and they offered her an early retirement. And so within a year, I retired too. It was always our plan to go to New Mexico. There was a big art community. She was an artist. And when we got out there, I was very happy to take up photography and woodworking and do things that I hadn't had time for.
And tennis.
before.
Don't forget tennis.
Yes.
At MCCA, you also said you did not like the fact that they were laying off people and they were forcing you to lay off people too. So that was another reason that pushed you towards retirement also, right?
Well, that was with the Atlantic companies that
Okay.
happened. I was a regional manager, and we were having a tough time maintaining our business, although we had the only profitable region in the country. But vice presidents came down and they said, you need to trim the staff. And that was the hardest thing I ever had to do, is to tell people they weren't wanted anymore and they didn't have a job. There was a lot of crying. It was a very difficult time. And I couldn't see any end to that. It didn't look to me like I was going to escape that job. So that was when I went over to the MCCA and finished my career over there.
You recently moved back to Michigan to be closer to your two daughters. Your son's obviously in Philadelphia. When did you come back, and what were some of the reasons behind that? Just wanted to get home again?
26 great years in New Mexico. Got involved in the art world. I took 10,000 photographs, and I did a lot of woodworking that I never had time for before. We had a great time, but we got a little older, started having some medical problems. Our daughters were terrific in visiting out there every summer, and that was great. And they liked New Mexico too. But there came a time when it was better for us to come back here and be close to the daughters here in Michigan. And I must say, since that time, they've just been terrific in helping us make the adjustment.
And you're not just saying that because she's sitting here too, right?
Sorry.
You're not just saying that because she's sitting here, right?
Right.
Don't say a word. You're just going to get in trouble
Right.
with that. Next Wednesday, B-17 flight, arranged by your daughters also. You're looking forward to that, right?
Oh, my daughters arranged that for me. Big surprise to me. I didn't even know that existed. I didn't know about the museum, but now I do.
But it brought you to us for this interview today, right?
This interview, I'm very grateful to them for taking the time and mostly for preserving these memories. I think it's a great job.
I always ask this final formal question of everybody that I interview. Is there anything that you would like to say to future generations of viewers of this particular video or in the Library of Congress, etc.? Is there anything you want to tell the young people watching this as they're coming up?
Well, probably two things, Mike. I want them to remember this war experience and about the brave people that went to war for our country. It needs to be remembered. The second thing is, I think today the planet is in big trouble. I think we need to do more to save this planet for our future generations. Perhaps our grandchildren won't be affected, maybe their children, but at some point the planet is going to be damaged. And I belong to a lot of environmental companies, and I hope they're successful in that regard. The other thing is I want to thank you for all the work you put into this, for Jerry for doing the work, and especially the Yankee Air Museum for making it all possible.
Any last things you want to say about anything at all, whatever comes to your head?
No, I hope I remembered well.
You did.
It's a little
You did a
difficult.
great job.
A little difficult at this point, but
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you.